Dr. Soto. We are so happy to have this opportunity where we can be able to converse and talk about God's restoration in a panel discussion. So we're going to invite a few people up at this time. We have on our panel tonight, Pastor Soto, he's going to be joining us on the panel. We have Jonathan Williams, he's going to be joining us on the panel, as well as Sasha Marie Marshall and Pastor Joe. We invite those individuals up. I want to remind you we do have our raffle that's going to be happening right after our panel tonight, before our closing song. So we want to get prepared for that. So those of you who have written up your registration each night and been faithful in that, we're going to be raffling off the 3 prizes that we have tonight so that you can leave tonight with an additional blessing. Not only that God restores, but that also that the Lord blesses in mysterious ways. Tonight, as we are beginning our panel discussion, we have a few questions that have already come in. I'm going to start with just a general question. This to start us off, and this goes to every one of you. The first question I want to ask is, what does restoration mean to you? What does God's restoration mean to you personally? What does it mean? Any one of you can start. Okay.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Happy Sabbath, everyone. God's restoration for me means being reconciled to Him.
All right.
And to His image.
So, like, reconcile, that's like a big word. So for those who are the 12 and under crowd that's watching, what does reconcile mean?
Reconcile means to me being restored to the image of God. So,
all right.
Yes.
All right. Excellent. Restored to the image of God. All right. What he intended us to be from the start. Okay. All right. Okay. Who's next? Who would like to go next? What does God's restoration mean to you?
To add to what my sister just said is, what was original in man is God's image. Is going to be restored to its original condition. And that's a process that's, it's a lifetime process to be complete, to be perfected. But God has promised that if we put our trust and our faith in Him, He's going to restore us to our original condition. And that's what restoration means to me.
All right. So,
Restoration is putting the pieces back. Because in the brokenness that I feel in some areas of my life, I'm aware that the only person that can fix the brokenness is Him. And I know He's able. And I was encouraged listening to Pastor Soto how God is generous. I think that's a great word. I never used that word in that context. God is generous when He does restoration. And I think I need that generous attitude, that generous touch of the restorer.
Amen. All right.
Amen. Well, definitely restoration for me has to do with many things. I like what the brother said here. We were made in the image of God, but because of sin, we don't reflect the image of God, or we don't reflect it. Yeah, we don't have the character of God, and that's what God is working on us. So that's one aspect of what restoration means to me. On another sense, there are so many things in this life that are important to me. Jesus said that He came to give us abundant life. And around abundant life is this relationship thing, and relationships are very important to me. And over the years, there's so much relationships that have been broken, And restoration to me means that those relationships are restored to the best that they can in this broken, sinful world, if that makes sense.
Powerful, powerful. Thank you. Thank you all for sharing, indeed. The next question is, this is actually a question pertaining to your sermon. You asked during your sermon to take a personal inventory. And the question is asking, is it a safe place to be if I cannot come up with an answer to the inventory question? So I guess the question is asking, is it a bad thing if you can't think of something that God has restored or is restoring in your life?
Definitely, it's not a bad thing. It's just perhaps sometimes we're not ready for it,
Okay.
or we're not there yet. And sometimes we need to trust in the restorer, that there is times in our lives when there's seasons in our life where restoration comes. I have dealt with individuals who are not aware of their need to be restored until they hit their 30s or their 40s, and all of a sudden something, a light turns on, they wake up and they're like, this is broken, I need this restored.
Yeah.
So if an individual is in a place where they don't understand what needs to be restored, it's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Your time perhaps has not yet come. But when you become aware, embrace this God who restores all things.
Amen. Any others who would like to share? Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, in addition to what Pastor Fidel pointed out, because that's true, sometimes we need a certain maturity so that we can realize, hey, I was lacking this, I was missing this. But another situation may be when somebody is so broken that in his or her brokenness, he or she doesn't even have the power to make an inventory. And I've been there. I know how it feels when you are so lost that you are lost. I mean, you have no ability to put things together and see where you are. Because for an inventory, you need to be able to list some things.
Yeah.
But you are not aware of what can even be put on that list, or you don't have the power to just make that list so that you can see, okay, this is what I'm lacking, this is what I need, this is what has been broken. And in those moments, at least that's how I experienced it, God always has people that he works through. And somebody will come along with you and strengthen you, talk into your life, even help you make the inventory. I remember about a certain time of my life when I was in a situation like the one I described, and somebody literally made a list for me and told me, hey, see, these things, this, and this, in X years, you will see God will fix them. And the person was right. God indeed was generous.
Amen.
Praise God.
Amen.
I remember actually it was at the end of last year, our family, we take a habit of kind of doing an inventory of how the Lord has blessed us over the year. And I remember we were running kind of short on things. And we knew the Lord had blessed us over the year, but just being able to come up with it at that moment, we just could not. And I remember my wife, she instituted this jar that we keep in our house now where we drop slips of paper of God's blessing every time God's done something for us. And now that jar is almost, half full now, as we've been dropping things in it. So I anticipate we're going to have a lot to talk about. So it may be that in life, sometimes we don't think about the things that God has restored because we're not noting them when they happen, and they just kind of pass out of our mind. So it might just be being more intentional about recording those things so that we remember them. Yes.
Pastor Andrew, I grew up in a very dysfunctional home, very chaotic, very abusive. and I thought that was normal. I thought that was normal. One day, I was invited to a birthday party. I was a little boy. I was invited to a birthday party, one of my classmates, and when I walked into this home, I saw how the parents of my friend were interacting, and it was a revelation to me. I had never seen anybody, I'd never seen a couple interact in such loving ways with such respect and for each other. And I realized for the first time in my life what I was missing. And then that I wanted that.
Yeah.
But sometimes we live in such broken conditions that we don't know what we're missing out on.
Yeah.
And this is why it's so important that we as the people of God model to others what it is when we get there, what it is to live
Wow.
a godly life and to walk with God.
Amen.
And to allow him to restore us when that time comes.
Powerful. Thank you. Thank you. All right, we're going to go on to the next question that is here. And actually, this question has kind of been asked in a number of different ways. So I'm going to try and summarize all of the ones that are here in a simple way. The question that's being asked is, does it mean that if it's never restored, so your statement, God does restore, and if it's not restored, he will restore it eventually. If it's never restored, what does that mean? Does it mean it was not given by God? What does that mean? And then one individual is asking it because in the case of, if you were, sick from birth, like you were sick from birth and you're still carrying that sickness even now, does that mean that, God's restoration is not going to be a reality in your life? Yes.
I'll do the first one and then the second one.
Okay.
For the first one, I always have this saying where what is for you is for you, and no one can take it from you. So if you don't have it, then it wasn't for you. And for the second one with the person who's sick, I know this is easier said because I'm not in that situation, but a lot of times what we go through is a witness and a glory and a testament for God, and not necessarily for us per se, but those around us.
Amen.
Is what I think.
Yes.
I just believe that the word never is a word you have to really look at, because never could be a very long time. God has promised restoration to that which was broken. And that never may not come when you want it, but it's a promise. Even that sick person who was born sick, God has promised restoration for that person. And so in the end, all things will be restored. It just may not be in the time that you expect it to be restored.
All right. And this actually touches on another question that came in, and it was talking about basically, so, they thought that restoration was something that just happens at the second coming. So it sounds like, for that person who was sick, they may indeed be waiting until the coming of Jesus Christ for glorification before they are restored. So is there a portion of restoration that we should expect now on a daily experience, or is this just something that is off in the future when Christ comes in the clouds of glory?
I can just say that for myself, the greatest restoration that I've experienced is much like the prodigal son. I was truly lost. I didn't know God. In fact, I hated all things spiritual. I hated church. I hated anything religious. But God has a spirit, and that spirit moves when God moves that spirit on you, and your heart is able to receive it. God is able to break through that hardened heart and bring restoration. And so the greatest restoration for me was just the fact that I saw Jesus high and lifted up. And I accepted him as my Lord and Savior.
Amen.
And so that was the beginning of my restoration to the image and likeness of God.
Amen.
I think that's there for everyone.
Anyone else like to share? Yes.
I would like to share two little pieces from my own experience. I don't know how many of you know that I had one of my fingers chopped off. Now, the finger got restored
Oh, wow.
to the point that you can see which one it is. I can't show it to you because that means something bad. But but it's one of my fingers, okay?
Okay.
And it's interesting that although it has been healed, and I can play the piano, I can play the guitar with it, because that was my trauma. How am I going to play the piano? How am I going to play the guitar? And beyond that, how am I going to stand in front of a congregation with exactly that finger chopped off? And God restored it. But every time I touch it, I have a different sensation in it compared to the other fingers, the fingertips. That's a constant reminder to me that restoration is not complete. It's in process. God did a lot for me. I mean, amazingly intervened for me. So much so that in that morning, the night after my accident, because I had a car accident, I dreamt that God was restoring my finger. And I woke up and it hurt. But I knew God was working on it. But it still hurts sometimes when when the weather changes, and it's a constant reminder that it takes a process. Another very interesting reality that I'm still dealing with on a daily basis almost. In my youth, I think my giftedness, my main giftedness was music, and I had a very, very strong opera voice. So much so that it became a constant temptation for me to leave ministry and go to sing on the big stage.
Wow.
But then God always puts something in between, you know, and something always happened to my voice, either allergy or some sort of attack on my vocal cords, that to this day, my voice is not what I know my voice used to be. Why isn't God restoring my voice? It may be that God knows the only way for Him to keep me safe is not to completely restore my voice on this earth. So there are many things that God can have in His equation when it comes to our brokenness and the restoration of it.
And that actually ties, yes, you had something to share? That actually ties into a text of Paul where he speaks about the thorn in his flesh. And now God says that in his weakness, his strength is made perfect. So does that mean that there are some things that God intentionally leaves unrestored? Because there was actually one question in here that was asking about two individuals in Scripture that I guess the question was asked. Let me read it as it is. God restores, but what about Esau or the older son in the story of the prodigal?
son,
Yeah. So yeah, you're looking at me.
Yeah. So let me back up a little bit and just encourage anybody who is aware that there is things in your life that need to be restored. I want to remind you of the gospel stories, of those stories where Jesus went around restoring people's bodies, restoring a cripple, restoring a blind man, restoring people health-wise, restoring people back into community. The lepers, that once they had leprosy, they were outcast, they were ostracized. But we see Jesus restoring those people back into community. We see him restoring the Samaritan woman who was also full of shame because she had had many husbands and now she was living with another man. And so that was a source of shame, but Jesus restored her. And so we see Jesus being on a mission to restore humanity in their present physical condition, and also to restore humanity back into relationship with the Father. So I want to encourage you to go down on your knees and go to war in prayer and talk to God about, this restoration that perhaps is lacking in your life. And it is sometimes possible that it will not be complete on this earth. And for that I say, remember Hebrews chapter 11, where these men, by faith, knew that the promises that God had given to them were true and that they were faithful. And we read that Abraham, he knew that this land that he was living in would be given to him, but it didn't happen in his lifetime. And he died with the knowledge that it was going to happen, even though he didn't see it in his lifetime. And his children and his great-grandchildren, they saw it and they lived it.
400 years later.
400 years later.
Well, actually more than that, but
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
it was an incredible amount of
So
time.
so restoration is very, very possible.
Would you please repeat that question, because it seemed interesting
It did, okay.
with Esau and
So yeah, God restored, but what about Esau or the older son in the prodigal
Those are good
prodigal
questions.
son story, I guess?
so I'm still trying to find a connection between the two characters, because Esau is the bad guy, at least that's how we label him. But I don't see that God would somehow neglect Esau on a personal level of restoration. The person may have those verses in mind where in our translation it comes across pretty strong when God says that Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. But
Isn't that the
that's not
birthright? Isn't that
that's
the
not
birthright?
about not about their personal life or their chance to be restored. It's more about the role they played in the plan of salvation, the role that God, so to speak, destined for them. So I don't see an issue there. Now, with the other character, with the prodigal son that we think was not prodigal, but actually was prodigal,
The one at home, yeah.
because you can be prodigal in two ways, at least. You go away, okay, or you stay home, but still be a prodigal, okay? Now, with regard to that son, I see the father doing all his best to restore him just the way he restored his little brother that became the bad prodigal son.
Okay.
Because the father had the same kind attitude to him. He said, son, everything I have is yours.
Right.
So that what else could the father have done for him rather than say, son, everything I have is yours. What is that you lack? What do you miss? God really restores even the prodigal son that stays home. Both of us, the one that left and the one that stays home, we need the restoration
So
of the father.
he didn't have anything to restore then? Maybe his self-esteem, I guess. I don't know. Yes.
Yeah, we don't know we don't know the rest of the story, right?
Yeah.
But
No.
we,
Yeah.
we
it
do
finishes
see
there.
we do see that that the father is attempting.
Right.
Right. In the case of Esau, we read the story, but we don't see Esau seeking restoration, but rather Esau was seeking vengeance. And so, in the case of my mother, or even in my own case, restoration didn't come until there was forgiveness. You see, because if we don't forgive, then we want to revenge, right? And that's not a good place to be. There can be no healing while we are angry. There can be no restoration in anger or in revenge mode. It is when we surrender and we forgive that God can then begin to work in us.
So we have a part to play then in this restoration. We're not just kind of sitting idly by and just letting God just restore everything to us. We have to. There's something in us that we also have to do. Kind of like it sounds like what's in the Lord's Prayer, where except we are forgiving those who trespass against us. There's a portion that God is doing for us, but we are also expected to do something for others at the same time. Yes.
Yeah, I kind of see in those relationships, broken relationships, Jacob and Esau,
Okay.
the prodigal son and his older brother.
Yeah.
And I see that God is in the midst of the restoration process, even there, because he restores, he brings the prodigal back. The Spirit of God brings him back. The Spirit of God moves on Jacob. It's like the story of Joseph. His 11 brothers.
Right.
Threw him into a pit. And at the end of his life, he says to his brothers, "You intended it for evil, but God meant it for good." That even to this very day, many people are saved. And so I think when God is in the hearts of those, he is moving Jacob, Joseph, and the prodigal son. He's about restoring even relationships. And so that's where I kind of see in those characters.
We got a number of questions that are coming in, so we're going to hasten on to the next one. Did somebody else want to share something?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out something. You were asking whether we have a role to play in the restoration. A restoration, if we take it as a synonym for healing, is the same as salvation. So what can we do for that to happen? We have to allow the restorer to work, to model us, to bring the pieces back. That's what we can do. We cannot really restore ourselves. There's no self-restoring power within ourselves unless God provides it. Even at the body level, science says, and that's true, that our body has been constructed in a way that we have a restoring power within us. But what science misses is that the restoring power is not our power, it's God's power working in us. So anybody that doesn't have the working of the power of God in him or her may miss out on that restoring power. So it's God doing that restoration. We allow God to work. Now this is something interesting that I noticed in my own experience. I'm curious if anybody else sees the same. This is what I'm seeing. Sometimes losses happen in our lives. We lose things. There are things broken. Okay, and there's a need of restoration. But in those moments, there are dreams that are shattered. They just fall apart. They are ruined. And then we start that process of mentally rebuilding the dream. And we cannot really redeem the dream that we had. But God can. And what I've noticed is that even if the dream falls apart here, there's a moment already prepared by God in the future when your dream comes back. But the dream that comes back is not the dream at the stage where you left it here or where it fell apart. It's a dream on which God has been working throughout your turmoil, your brokenness, and just gives that dream back to you.
Okay.
I'm curious if somebody can resonate to this, but that's how I experienced that.
Definitely. It's sometimes we have dreams and they don't. Things happen and we think that they are ruined. Again, using my mother's illustration, my mother's experience, she had a dream of retiring, and that was ruined. That was broken. But God restored that dream, and now she's living that dream. She is a retired person working on her garden, and God has given her a dream, restored that dream, not in the way that she expected, but in a much, much better way, because there are other things that were added to this new reality that she is now living.
All right. So I'm going to get to these questions. We have a few of them that have come in while we've been talking. In Revelation, John saw the tree of life. This tree is for the healing of the nation. What sickness are we going to be healed from?
That's for you.
Yes,
I love that passage.
Okay.
because that is a healing or restoration that happens when we think we should have been already restored. Nevertheless, the leaves in the Bible, they are not for somebody to eat them. Leaves in the Bible, they are good because they give the shade under which people can rest. And the restoration, the heavenly restoration, and then the new earth in the Bible is previewed or pre-tasted, foretasted by the Sabbath rest. So the leaves of the tree of life are the canopy under which those that have been rescued from planet Earth, the nations, they will have their time of rest and enjoy their Sabbath rest. And yes, there will be elements of restoration in that, because remember, throughout the 1,000 years, according to the Bible, there will still be things happening, clarifying the big scheme of work on what God has done in the plan of salvation. And then at the end of the 1,000 years, there's still a destruction of evil. And only after that, God removes every tear, wipes away. That's a beautiful way of saying it. Wipes away. And after God wipes away every tear, you will rest under the tree of life, under the beautiful canopy of the leaves of the tree of life. That's how I understand it.
Okay.
The other thing that picture, I love that picture because I picture these nations sitting under that tree and fellowshipping.
Amen.
And fellowshipping.
Because that's Sabbath. That's Sabbath, in essence.
The nations on this earth have been at war with each other for centuries, and there they are.
Absolutely, yeah.
Healing old wounds and relationships.
And that kind of healing, that's
friendship.
the culmination of restoration.
Yeah.
Amen. All right.
But that question was great. Who has that question?
I could give their number. No. The next question is, let me see. Okay. I know that at the end of time, God defeated death. But will he restore my life with a new spouse, or what if he doesn't? I don't know.
Would you repeat that?
I will repeat it. I know that at the end of time, God defeated death. But will he restore my life with a new spouse, or what if he doesn't?
So those are good questions, right? A lot of times we long for spouses because we think that in a spouse we will be somehow fulfilled. We will be. We long for that fellowship, for that relationship. I think, as Paul says, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has been able to imagine what God has in place. And I want to encourage you to yes, maybe God has something better to you than a spouse. Maybe God has something better for you than a marriage or a relationship or something like that. Maybe he has way something better that we can't even imagine. But that definitely is a very natural longing that we have, because God created us for relationship, and we naturally long for relationships, yes.
But to me, the difficulty of that question was that the person didn't ask if God will restore him with the wife he had. He wanted a new one. So, yeah, it's very hard to get that one, you know.
True.
I've seen the read somewhere that in the kingdom that comes there will be no one given to marriage, And so I don't wonder if that means that,
Yeah, that's a good question. Matthew 19, there's a passage, there's a unique passage in the Bible. But if you read it very carefully, it seems like it's more like a reply of Jesus Christ to an intriguing question of those that try to tempt him, rather than giving them an explanation of what will really be there. He just confuses them more or puzzles them more. That's at least how I see it. It's very hard to build on that particular passage a full theory of how our life in heaven and the new earth will be. Nevertheless, I think one aspect that can be seen in the Bible is, and in the Sabbath concept, is that some sort of social life, relational life, is part of that realm. Okay? And eventually our longing is more than sexuality, is that social relationship, that fulfillment. Because otherwise, hey, if you had a good, a positive sexual experience throughout your existence, then you may be longing in your limited mind for something like that. But what do you do with those people that have never had a good sexual experience?
They too will be able to sit under the tree and be restored.
Yes, I mean, there will be leaves for them too.
The last question, how are we able to identify what God's restoration is if we don't really know him?
That's you.
What? Can you ask it again?
All right, I'll ask it again. How are we able to identify with God's restoration if we don't really know him?
So, I believe that if you don't know him, then you will not be able to recognize whether or not that restoration is from him. That's my answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would just add one aspect here. Pastor Fidel pointed out something, and I think that will stay with me for a while. God's restoration is generous. God is generous in his restoration. Even if somebody doesn't recognize God's restoration, God does not abandon the human being. And even when we don't recognize his work, he still works some sort of restoration, even in a limited way, because he needs our acceptance so that he can have full access to our life.
I think I would also answer in this way, that there are many people who use different terminology to identify what we know to be the hand and movement of God. So they'll say the planets aligned the right way this week for me to be able to get this job or to be able to get out of this situation, or the universe gave me back this thing, right? They have their own little ways of being able to identify it, but really and truly they're speaking about God restoring something to their lives. They might not really recognize the God of Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac, but I mean, it's still God they're speaking about. They're still speaking about in their own limited way, and God is still, we don't believe that God is only working in the Christians' lives for restoration. We believe that he's working in every person's life. I mean, if the Holy Spirit is working in our lives even before we believe, he's the one who brings us to the point of actually knowing that we need Jesus. So he's restoring us even before we know we need restoration. So it's just my thought on the matter. So that was our last question, unless somebody sends another one in. I don't see one coming in. So at this time, we're going to transition to our raffle, and I thank let's give a hand to our panel. Thank the panel for their wonderful answers. I'm going to grab the raffle and the bag here. Just give me a moment. Go on in, please.